I'm literally wiping snot. But since it's a bunch of dudes, I mean, I could just blow it out probably. Yeah. Woo. All right, let me clarify what I'm feeling right now, because that did hit me. But at the same time, when you have a group of guys like that are around you, you feel like you could run through a wall. We hope that's what this has been for you guys this weekend. Certainly that's what we want to build over and over and over again here at Northview, is a community of guys specifically that feel like they have a group of guys who would surround them, lift them up, carry them through life's journeys, challenge them to be the men that God's called them to be. And at times when their faith is running a little low, encourage them so that they can run through those walls that they see out in front. Guys, I got a couple thank yous that I want to give before I get going here today. Josh and Brian just set the tone. So incredible. I mean, literally, I think I saw the paint peeling off the walls. Those guys preached the paint off the walls. So grateful for their friendship and for them sacrificing their weekend. They're both going to go preach 3 or 4 times tomorrow after flying back and doing whatever they're doing. But they were so delighted to share here. I want to thank Eric. Eric has done a phenomenal job at spearheading details, even down to the race you just saw on the air mattresses with the boys. All I was praying as that was happening is no more broken bones, no more broken bones, no more broken bones. That was a ton of fun. Big shout out to Eric and to our staff team for doing this. There's a group of men who kind of have been behind the scenes here from Northview. They showed up early to set things up. They've been doing some of the dirty work, some of the grunt work as the conference has gone on. They're going to stick around at the end, and they're going to help put this building back together for church tomorrow. So grateful for them. We got a group of guys that drove over from Quincy, Illinois, from the Crossing. And as a part of their weekend, and you want to talk about uncommon, you're talking about a couple guys that didn't even know you by name, who said, we want to come and serve for 2 days over here in Danville, and we'll just do whatever needs to be done. We'll do what we can do so that as many guys as possible of your church don't have to miss any part of the conference. They've just been here selflessly serving for the last 24 hours, whatever needs to happen. And this is the third year in a row that they've done it, and I'm kind of getting to a point where I feel like it's time for us to pay it back. Like, it's time. So whether we go there with a group in August when they do their annual Uncommon to do the very same thing, you need us to cook hot dogs, we'll cook hot dogs. You need us to take out the trash, we'll take out the trash. You need us to pick up speakers and take them back and forth to their hotels or to the airports, whatever. We'll do whatever. Or if it's another church that's in the region that wants to do an Uncommon, like we were in a spot a few years ago, had never done anything like this, we want to send a group of guys to try to help that happen. And we'll follow up with you all later if you want to be a part of making that. We're so grateful for the Crossing. I'm grateful for this church that we call Northview, that we call home, and for the privilege that I have to be your pastor. It's truly an honor. It is an honor, and it's not one that I take lightly. And seasons and moments like this are seasons that I especially lean into because I realize as time is going on how special and precious this is. But enough about that. I know we got to get into Daniel today. And we're going to try to wrap this story, at least as we see through the first couple chapters of Daniel up today. Because I think the story that we're going to get into today is going to really set the tone for us. I love the way this story has come alive for us this weekend and the way it's really set a tone and showed us how God has called us to be men in the world who are uncommon. And I love how that story has been taken to life. And maybe you've been able to see kind of the answer to the question, like, how do you do that? How do you, as a man, how do you live in a culture that is so set against God on a day in and day out basis? I think there's really only 3 options. One is you assimilate. You assimilate. You just start to blend in with everybody else that's around you. That's one of the things that happens to a lot of guys is they live in a world that's set up against God, that doesn't value God, doesn't love God, doesn't worship God. And because that's the common path, You just start to assimilate and blend in and just kind of live that same way. That's one option. The second one is to separate. It's to separate and to say, well, I know that is ungodly, and you go build your bubble somewhere away from everyone, away from everything, in an effort to try to protect your integrity while separating yourself from the world that God has called you to go influence and reach. The third option is to permeate. You can assimilate, you can separate, or you can permeate. And you can find your place in the world, and you can find in your little corner of the world opportunities and ways that you can fight and hold on and live with integrity for God and also make the world and the community around you better. And that's exactly what Daniel and his 4 friends did. These guys, you cannot underestimate and miss this. These guys were teenagers with their whole life out in front of them. And they were captured. And they're living a life that they didn't want. They didn't get to have the conversation about, what do you want to do when you grow up? Where do you want to go to college? What do you want to be? They had a specific set of skills, and because they had some specific skills, some of their captors said, we're going to separate you out from everybody else, and we're going to make a special kind of servant out of you. This wasn't the life that they wanted or the life that they chose. They were carried off and told to conform to this pagan world that they were forced into, except they didn't. And that's why their story's in the Bible. That's why their story is in the Bible. They stood out against the rising tide of culture that was anti-God, and they lived out their faith boldly. They resolved not to bow down to idols. They challenged to stand, even if the fire and the flames were burning. And so as we get to session 3, we're in Daniel chapter 6, if you guys want to turn there. I know it's just a couple chapters from where we were, but a lot has happened in a couple chapters. Daniel is no longer this teenage exile. He's an old man at this point. I mean, maybe 80 years of age. He's an old man. There's a lot of life that's happened in a couple chapters as we read it in the Bible. Empires have risen and fallen. King Nebuchadnezzar, that we were just talking about last session, he's gone. Babylon's taken over, Medes and Persians. You got king now named King Darius that's reigning. But here's the thing about Daniel. He's still standing. He's 80 years old. He's still standing. He's still living faithful for God. You know, I know in this room, we got guys of all different ages, all different backgrounds. We got some young people. We got some teenagers in here. And we got some guys who are a lot closer to Daniel's age. You know what? I love that. I love that. And if you ever felt for a second, if that's you, if you feel like, man, I'm a lot closer to Daniel in this story than I am Daniel in the first story, and you might be tempted to think that I don't know if I fit in here, shut up. We need examples, every one of us, of people who are trying to be faithful to the end. To the end. Maybe some of you guys didn't start strong. So what? You're here and you're going to finish strong. And that matters. That means something. And I'm proud of you for being here. Daniel is still standing. He's still permeating. He's still shining. He's still living for God. He's doing so much so that he's now gained influence with this king. And among all his leaders, and there's 120 satraps and 3 administrators, Daniel is one of the chief administrators. And he's so distinguished. Verse 3 of chapter 6 says this. That he so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps that by his exceptional qualities that he had planned to set him over the entire kingdom. Picture this. I mean, this is a kid that was captured as a teenager, and now at 80, he's being poured into and set up to be over the entire kingdom, only behind the king himself. I guess that makes this point. An uncommon man stands out. Don't ever forget that. He didn't blend in. He didn't try to blend in. He didn't compromise. He didn't adapt his convictions. He had exceptional qualities. Like men, when you think about exceptional qualities, and you think about the fact that he was noted for his exceptional qualities, what would your family, your neighbors, your coworker, your spouse say your exceptional qualities are? Like, this feels a little bit like Brian's trophy conversation. A lot of what we aim for in life and a lot of what we set up and focus on as far as being exceptional, maybe your talent, maybe your hustle, maybe your title, maybe something you own or possess, maybe your influence. So Daniel had exceptional qualities. Like he was wicked smart. Like Daniel was the chief of the Magi. You know the Magi in the New Testament? The Magi, the guys that were looking up to the sky, that were reading the signs and the stars and knew that a disturbance in the force had just happened, and we're going to walk until we find where that star is. That's the Magi. Daniel was the chief of the Magi. In fact, in like a really cool little big picture part of this whole story, Daniel was part of setting the DNA of the group of guys that would one day watch the stars and find Jesus. How cool is that? How cool is that? This teenage captive plays a part in this story that one day will point to Jesus. And it was because he had a gift that God had given him, and he served and used that gift in a powerful and intentional way. But that wasn't even his most exceptional quality. Look at the next verse. The next verse contains a staggering statement about his life and what was most exceptional about him. Verse 4. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt or negligent. They said the most outstanding thing about this guy is that we can't figure out his flaws. He doesn't have a secret life. He doesn't have this thing that we could trap him in. They looked at his finances. They looked at his record. They looked for skeletons, and they found nothing. And maybe you're asking, like, well, why were they even doing that? Come on, guys, you know better than that. You understand that in the world that we live in that's apart from God, one guy's success is stealing from another man's success. And you better believe that if there's 120 satraps and 3 administrators and Daniel's going to be the one that's given the highest authority, that's not going to go over with everybody really well. And that there's plenty of people who feel like they deserved that job or that role or that influence over Daniel. Is this starting to sound like the places that some of you guys work? And you can't celebrate somebody's success because their success is somehow highlighting maybe your weakness or what you perceive as failure, or other perceives as failure. They didn't like him. So they try to figure out, how do we get this guy out? There was jealousy among the other leaders. They wanted him gone. So they start digging to try to find a way to accuse him so they can get him out of this role of influence. Here's what verse 5 says. This is their conclusion. We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. Imagine if that was said about you. That when someone dug into your life and they started watching from afar, they were peeping in the windows, they were watching over the emails, they were spying on your life, that instead of finding a secret addiction or a hidden financial compromise or an alternate online personality, a double life that you were living, what they found is this guy really loves God. And every time we try to catch him, every time we try to find him, every time we try to trip him up, all we ever find is that this guy is serving God. What if the only way the culture could trap you is through your obedience to God? The only way to knock you down is to criminalize your faith. That's exactly what they do with Daniel. This other group of leaders goes to the king. And kings are so vulnerable because they're so arrogant. And especially when you have a culture where a lot of times the kings are saying, like we saw last session, bow down to me. It's not just there's a lot of gods, I'm a god. And so these guys trick the king, who's arrogant, into writing a particular law that would separate worship of Daniel's God and all other gods and would require a trap. They set up a trap. It would require. So they say, this king, they get to sign this decree that for 30 days, no one can pray to any god except the king. The king is arrogant. He loves this. He's flattered by this. And so without even realizing the implications, he signs an irrevocable law saying, let's do it. 30 days. Nobody can pray to any other god or man except the king. And the punishment? The lion's den. You thought the fiery furnace was crazy? Like, these guys in ancient times were savages. I mean, fiery furnaces? No, let's try lion's den. Let's just feed you to lions. Okay, sounds good. It's the law. Irrevocably. What's Daniel do? Look at verse 10. When Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. And 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. He didn't get on social media and post some outrage. He didn't get a committee to listen to his complaint. He didn't strategize and escape. He got down on his knees and he prayed. He prayed just as he had done before. It was almost like he was basically saying to everybody who wanted to hear it, guys, listen, you know where you'll find me. You know where you'll find me. I'm going to be right back at home. I'm going to be doing what I'm always done. I'm going to be worshiping God as I've always worshiped. You know where to find me. And where you find me, you will find me steadfast in my devotion to God. How many of us could say that to anyone and say at all times, you know where to find me. And when you find me, you will find me serving, worshiping, and devoted to God. I think there's maybe a misnomer about this story, and even the one before, that the courage for these moments comes in an instant in the crisis as it just kind of pops up. And that Daniel was like all of a sudden in this moment greatly courageous. And I don't think that's true. I think all of that courage in the moment was built over a lifetime of private, consistent prayer. The thing he remained the most faithful in was getting on his knees and praying to God, because no quality was greater than his dependence on God. I want you to hear that. No quality that you possess is greater than your dependence on God. No matter how gifted you are, no matter how influential you are, no matter how much money you have, no quality is more influential than your dependence on God. The secret to life, guys, is living dependent on God. You look at Jesus, and Daniel's story has a great connection to Jesus. Jesus was the most dependent person that ever lived. The guy who could walk on water, could turn a lunch of a little boy into enough for 5,000 people, who could heal diseases, who could reverse death. He's the most dependent person you've ever seen. Go read the Gospels again and look for it, and you will see he refuses to define himself outside of his relationship with his Father. And no matter how crazy his life got, the intensity of life never outpaced the frequency of his prayers. When life got heavy, he pulled back to pray. When life got busy, he pulled back to pray. When decisions, big ones, were looming, he pulled back to pray. He was the most dependent person that's ever lived, while simultaneously having the most exceptional qualities of any person who's ever lived. And so if that's how the Son of God lived his life, what are we doing trying to operate in our own strength every single day? The secret to life and living in this fallen world and permeating this world and living as God would call us to be is getting on our knees and being willing to surrender and to humble ourselves to someone who's superior to us. And guys, we don't like to do this. This is hard for dudes. To surrender to someone and to submit to them because they are superior to us. But here's what I'm saying. The lion's den did not create Daniel's courage. His prayer life did. His prayer life did. You could threaten him with death, and that wasn't going to change a thing. He had a rhythm. He had a relationship with God. And so 3 times a day, on his knees, facing Jerusalem, he prayed. And he didn't hide it. He didn't close the door or shut the window. He didn't even necessarily flaunt it, but he just stayed faithful. I think one of the great tragedies that the church is facing right now is that too many men have erased prayer out of their life. And I think a big part of the passivity that men are experiencing in their family leadership is connected to the lack of prayer. It's one of those things where, guys, we get these glimpses at times and we start to realize this, but then we get sucked right back into the way of the world and we assimilate. And we forget that God doesn't need us to be motivational speakers. God doesn't need us to be perfect fathers. He doesn't need us to do a lot, but what he really is counting on us to do is to be men of God who pray over their family, to see the need to kneel. And you know, Brian and Josh both touched on this, the power that your family receives when they see dad pray. And they know dad trusts God, and they know dad will lean into God, and they know that when the crisis hits, that's where they go. They are learning to do this because they're seeing dad do it first. And maybe you're going, man, this is too much for me. This is just too much for me. I don't know how to do that. That feels foreign. It feels weird. It feels awkward. Here's what I will say. A man who will not kneel to God will eventually bow to something else. You will. You will and you are. Whether it's temptation or ego or fear or success or comfort, if you will never kneel before God, you'll eventually bow before something else. But here's the inverse of that. A man who kneels before God can stand before anyone. They can stand before anyone because they know where their anchor is. Daniel's situation should have terrified him. Old man against a hungry lion. I don't even care if you're an old man, if you're just a man against a hungry lion. But I would imagine that if you're an old man, you feel even more vulnerable. He had political enemies. The law was sealed. The lions were real. But Daniel had something stronger than fear. He had a history with God. And his prayer had formed him. Men, prayer is just not something that spiritual men do. It is what forms you. It is what forms you. His prayer life, Daniel's prayer life, fueled and moved him through this story in such an incredible, powerful way. This is not about Daniel's strength. I know this is a story that involves his courage and his strength. This is a story about the anchor that Daniel had in his relationship with God. That you could threaten him with death. It didn't matter. He had that same faith of his three friends that would say, even if I don't survive this moment, I am all in. I am all in. So let's get back to the story. So Daniel doesn't stop praying. He just does what he normally does. And so it's easy for his friends or these other coworkers to find him praying. And they do, and they arrest him. And so they bring him before the king, and the king is distressed because he just now realizes what he did. He realized he signed an irrevocable law that is now going to lead to the death of Daniel. We don't get a whole lot of conversation at this point as to where the faith of the king is, but it's clear because of the level of distress that A, there was friendship at minimum with Daniel that was very treasured and special, but B, I think you start to see that there was something about Daniel that was winsome enough that this king was starting to see life through a different lens. And he is grief-stricken that he has written this law that is now going to mean Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den. He works all day to rescue Daniel. He tries to figure out, can I write another law? And it's no, he can't. It's done, it's done. So Daniel is lowered down into the lion's den. Just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were lowered down into that fiery furnace. And as he does, the king says these words in verse 16. He says, Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. Daniel doesn't recant. He doesn't ask for help. He doesn't negotiate. He says, okay. Okay. The den to everybody on the outside looked like defeat. The story basically leaves us where they close the hatch, they leave. It's the next day before we see anything happen. And so the king has just anxiously been up and not been able to sleep, and he's tore up over this thing. So the next morning he wakes up and he runs to the lion's den. And he shouts down in verse 20, he says, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God been able to rescue you? The fact that he's even asking the question is telling me something. If you went to go check on a lion and a man, you don't even really need to ask the question, did you make it out, right? But he asked on the way in, or he said on the way in, may your God spare your life. On the way out, on the next day, has your God been able to rescue you? Daniel answers, verse 22, my God sent his angel and he shut the mouth of the lions. After Daniel emerges, King Darius issues a decree that changes things for the entire group of captives who worship God, give them the ability to defend. But he also says this, Daniel's God, this is verse 26, Daniel's God is the living God, and he endures forever. He endures forever. This didn't just change the king's view of God. This changed an entire kingdom's view of God. An entire kingdom's view of God. Like, again, in the big picture, Daniel goes on, sets the groundwork for the Magi who end up seeing Jesus. Here's the other thing that's going on. Daniel preserved the faith of the nation of Israel and their worship of God at a time where they had no national identity. There was no nation of Israel. They had been taken over. They were gone. They were done. God had spoke that promise to Abraham, and through this people, all people of the earth will be blessed. By the time you get to Daniel's part of the story, man, it looks like that's done. We have no national identity. But one man steps up. One man makes a commitment to be uncommon. And it not only has an effect on his most influential friend, but on an entire kingdom. And we move out from there. Remember last year we talked about Nehemiah at Uncommon? When it comes to Nehemiah, Nehemiah's story comes after this. It was Nehemiah who was moved and was tore up on a heart level about the state of his homeland, which was no longer possessed by his home country. But there is a remnant, there is a group of people who are still faithfully believing and serving. And could we, he talks to the king at that time, rebuild that city? This is all interconnected. Through Daniel, this opportunity to step into a moment in human history against the tide of a culture that wanted nothing to do with God and was trying everything it could do to suppress God. Daniel says, I will be uncommon. I will be uncommon, and my commitment to the Lord is not going to change. In the big picture, God uses Daniel. It always goes further than we think, guys. This shows that it's always a bigger picture. When you stay faithful to the end, it always has a bigger impact than you ever could imagine. Your stand doesn't just affect you, it affects your wife and your kids and your kids' kids and your kids' kids' kids and your church and your coworkers and your community. And look, we can zoom out, and I realize that you're not actually facing literal lions, but there's a lot of figurative ones. There's a lot of cultural pressure. There's a lot of sexual temptation. There's a lot of opportunity to compromise. There's times when silence could cost us. There's a lot of passivity in our homes. There's a lot of spiritual apathy. Men, the culture doesn't need more common Christians. It needs uncommon ones who will not bow down to the idols of the culture. That when everybody else is compromising, you stay clean. When everybody else panics, you pray. When everybody else caves, you trust. When everyone else hides their sin, you repent. And here's the deal. It might cost you something. It might not cost you your life like it potentially was going to with Daniel. It might cost you a job. It might cost you your popularity. It might cost you a promotion. It might cost you some comfort. But you will not lose your soul. You will not lose your soul. So here's what I want you to ask in these closing moments. I want you to ask, and maybe only you can answer this, but where in my life right now am I blending in with the world around me? Where am I assimilating? Where have I been silent? Where have I bowed? Let me make sure to say this. Uncommon men are not perfect men. They are resolved men. They are redeemed men. All of us need Jesus. But part of what we're doing this weekend is we have camped out on this idea of resolve. Because I think for Daniel, and for that matter, everybody in these stories we've been watching, well before the crisis, there was a resolution. There was a resolve. There was a decision. There was like, I am going to stand no matter what. And if we could have a moment this weekend where you could resolve in front of the crisis, I think there's great value in that, because there's an opportunity for you to fall back on this moment where you go, no, I resolved to live for God no matter what. This is what one of those no matter what moments is. And maybe for you, you're in the crisis right now. And we're not talking about something in the future. You're living it right now. You can resolve in the crisis not to live this as the world would have you live, but to be pressing into the things and the ways of God. Where have I blended in? Where have I been silent? Where have I bowed? You know, last night we had an opportunity with these coins to make that resolve something very, very tangible. As a part of this worship response, we're going to do something similar again with the other side of that coin. If you didn't bring your other coin back in, there's others up here at the table. On this back side of that coin, there are two stamps. One is the head of a lion, and one is flames that are meant to encircle the head of that lion. Two stamps. Two opportunities for you to say, I resolve to be an uncommon man. I resolve to be an uncommon man. I will not bend to the ways of this world. I will not be conformed. I will be transformed before that moment comes where the pressure mounts and the temptation is on you. Before the test, be uncommon. Stand tall now and remember later this commitment that you are making. And when the lions are waiting for you, may you, like Daniel, say, you know where to find me. You know where to find me. I will be on my knees. As your pastor, I declare this to you. You will know where to find me. You will know where to find me. With every last breath in my being, I will live to serve God till the end. But I need you to help me do that. You need me to help you do that. So let's now, in this moment, not miss the opportunity to affirm that we need each other, that this world is a mess, but that the kingdom of God and the light that shines through Jesus is still brighter and greater. And even if we suffer for standing, our God is greater. And he's promised more reward than we could ever fathom or be able to put into our understanding. He has promised it. So may we in this moment resolve to be faithful and to be uncommon to the end. Will you stand with me? And will you pray? Heavenly Father,